Hi everyone, my name is Miranda Erickson. My pronouns are she, her. I come from the University of the Fraser Valley, which is up in Canada. So for that reason, I'm going to have to give you quite a bit of context before I go into my research study, just because it's changed over time, and I'll be able to touch to that throughout the presentation. So similar to how America has had a lot of anti-trans legislation passed over the past couple of years, Canada is seeing that trend currently. To give you some reports from around COVID to present, the BC Commissioner of Human Rights Office gave a report that said from 2020 to 2021, we saw a 46% increase in hate incidents targeting sexual orientation in BC. And those hate incidences were more likely than the overall percentage to involve use of force. There has been a series of protests against a certain educational resource that exists within BC, but it's been used across Canada. It's called SOGI, S-O-G-I, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. I'll speak about it a little bit further, but just for context now, there have been tons of protests against this educational resource. And that was in just last September. More recently, we've seen our most, I would say, aggressive bill against trans youth being passed in Alberta, but there have been all sorts of bills introduced and passed across Canada. And more recently, just earlier this year, Canada's version of the CIA sent out a report saying that the violent threat posed by the anti-gender movement is almost certain to continue over the coming year, and that the violent actors may be inspired by the University of Waterloo attack, which was a knife attack where 3 people were injured, no fatalities, thankfully, to carry out their own extreme violence against the community or against other targets they view as representing the agenda. This is significant because we have an election for the province coming this year, and we have a federal election next year, and these are absolutely going to be elements within those. So what is SOGI? SOGI is the S-O-G-I, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity thing that I was talking about. It's an educational resource. It's not a curriculum, and it aims for the visibility, protection, and inclusion of queer and gender diverse students. So some things that have been happening against SOGI, there have been book bannings, think your Moms for Liberty, your Don't Say Gay bill down here, kind of the Canadian equivalent happening up north. Action for Canada, which is the group that I'm going to be speaking to today, uses this strategy. Some examples of SOGI practices would include common language, so affirming names and pronouns, educator training, and then safety and anti-harassment work. So who is Action for Canada? Action for Canada is a group that I noticed on brochures, flyers, posters that were at the SOGI protests last year. And so I was like, okay, I keep seeing this name, I keep seeing them related to this discourse. I want to know who they are. So I explored them. And my original project was going to be on a series of vandalisms of pride flags at my own university, which my group spoke to earlier in the conference, 11 incidences of hate-motivated vandalism over a period of 4 months, which is obviously very unfortunate. When we went to the counter protests, which was kind of a buildup of all this stuff, we saw Action for Canada, and on their side I came to realize that this is what I need to focus on. I need to do a study of this group because nothing has been done around them so far. So Action for Canada defines themselves as a nonprofit grassroots organization dedicated to lobbying all levels of government, to holding them account, to protect Christian heritage, rule of law, freedom of speech. We don't have that in Canada. We have freedom of expression, not freedom of speech. We hear that a lot in the anti-SOGI discourses, and have a list of current issues, because it's not just SOGI, it's also things like climate change, COVID, childhood vaccines, food security, 5G, 15-minute cities, legalizing drugs, all sorts of conspiracies on their site. Founded by Tanya Gaw, who says that her greatest mission is to declare that Canada is founded on Judeo-Christian biblical principles, forming our laws and our values, and provides a system of governance that sets us apart from totalitarian, extremist, and communist regimes. You can see more quotes from their site on the pages that I've handed out to you. I've bolded the sections that really draw to their conspiratorial thinking. And I'd like to note that they have made significant and effective lobbying attempts, including the removal of a Planned Parenthood and SOGI 123, the educational resource, in a district in Saskatchewan, having a school board trustee resign because of a flood of online hate and harassment. And on a recent visit to the legislature, I was told that Action for Canada members have been harassing politicians in person. The Canadian Anti-Hate Network labels them as a conspiracy and hate group, and I would only expand on that to say that they're a Christian nationalist conspiracy and hate group. So all of this leads to my research activities. So when I started to design this project, I said, okay, really what I want to know is what are the claims and discourses that Action for Canada is producing regarding their political LGBTQ activism page, which is their page where they host all the anti-SOGI stuff. My methods includes using a multimodal critical discourse analysis and a Foucauldian discourse analysis to identify and construct the discourses and claims that Action for Canada were making and connect them to broader social discourses that we were seeing. They also have photos and videos. I chose not to include those for the triggering content that were on them. In my coding, I actually had so many things come up that I got a little rainbow to code out of, which I thought was a happy little accident. Um, and my coding included like calls to action, media and non-government organizations, individuals and groups, claims and broad conspiracies, virtue signaling, specifically like right-wing language, mentions of educational institutions and resources such as SOGI, political and legal individuals, institutions and places, open-ended leading questions and statements. This one is important because I believe it is a very significant part of the think for yourself kind of dialogue that we hear. You know, it's like, oh, here's this thing and this thing, think for yourself, and that's very dangerous. And then also looking at sources, even if they were, good or bad, and anything to do with sex, sexuality, and gender were my focuses. I did not know I was going to have that many things to code. I thought it was going to be direct, but because they have so many different conspiracies, they all connect together. And that leads to my preliminary findings, because this is a research study in progress. So after months of reading and coding nearly 100 web pages, if I had to summarize the overarching conspiracy and underlying dominant discourse on this political LGBTQ activism page, it would be, and just bear with me, the United Nations Comprehensive Sexuality Education is a tool being used to infiltrate all levels of government and implement indoctrinating and grooming resources to destroy the family unit, exploit and abuse children, and implement a globalist Marxist system of government. So that's my interpretation. In an article that they published less than a year ago, I want to say 6 to 8 months, although they don't have a specific date, the article titled 911 Remove Your Children from Government-Funded Education, a verbatim quote reads, the SOGI 123 lesson plans provide a shocking look at how government-funded education is being used to break down societal norms and the natural family by confusing children, exploiting their innocence, and destroying their natural barriers against predatory behavior. Which is a lot. Again, this is preliminary research, so these are preliminary findings. I have three main ones. The first one is the first two are kind of the same, so I've collapsed them together. But what I've found, first and foremost, is that while problem construction was initially developed by collapsing diagnostic and motivational framing, or depicting the nature of the problem as justification for action, within the context of a particular case or story, the insertion of a secondary or tertiary conspiracy, then wholly validated by a presumably credible source, allows for a self-sustaining web of conspiratorial arguments, which I will explain because it's a lot of words. So an example of this would be the claim of a 4,000% increase of trans youth, which is unverified. You look for a source and it's just, it was cited here, and they cited it from here, and they cited it from here. But it doesn't matter that it's not real because it's a powerful number. So the example could be the claim of a 4,000% increase, where the existence of an increase, which would be the diagnostic framing, inherently justifies action. Like there's an increase, there must be something to do with it, which would be the motivational framing. Action for Canada's first article was titled Attack Against Parental Rights and Abuse and Mutilation of Children, Why is this being permitted? And a later updated article titled The BC Father's Battle Against the State-Sponsored Abuse of His Daughter Continues is an example of a case where this 4,000% increase makes sense. Then Action for Canada draws it together by claiming that the state, big S, big state, is overriding their rights and that it is the result of these quote-unquote radical political LGBTQ sex activist agendas. This becomes validated because Action for Canada is making these claims as a good source, but they also later bring in various psychologists, legal experts, church leaders, etc., to provide legitimacy alongside their arguments. And I say alongside very specifically because the person that they bring in, it could be a psychologist who's trained on the Harris psychopathy checklist. And so they talk about psychopathy related to, child sexual predators. And so the text beneath, that video where they're having that conversation will, talk about that, but it'll also include, again, that UN agenda, the global Marxism, the tearing apart the family unit. So the video is talking about one specific thing, and then the text talks about it beyond that. And so it's a very intentional, we're using this source to help justify these claims, but we're having multiple claims here, and we're only having one here, which is very dangerous, but also a very common strategy that they're using, and they tend to use it more a bit later, which goes into my second point. That Action for Canada started by making specific claims to support particular discourse construction. However, over time, there became less use of claims and more frame extension into other discourses, which resulted in multiple discourses being used for legitimization in the claims-making process. So it went from just being anti-SOGI and homophobia and transphobia to things about government overreach and parental rights. which don't exist in Canada, except now in Saskatchewan because Action for Canada did the thing, and now it's a bill, but originally was not. And finally, over time, Action for Canada methods of validating claims shifted from using specific cases, articles, and sources proposed to using authority figures and their knowledge, to using conspiracy theories as both evidence and justification. This goes back to the self-sustaining web of conspiracies. In the beginning, Action for Canada used specific cases, such as the BC father mentioned, to justify claims, and now they're more direct. Recently, I think in the past couple of months, Tanya Goff, founder of Action for Canada, met with Maxime Bernier, who is the leader of the People's Party for Canada, which is a federal far-right party, to talk about failed mass immigration that is creating a security threat and a housing crisis, to the destruction of our economy, the global agenda, the ongoing attacks against the Christian foundation of this nation, and the populist movement, and how to address when governments have gone rogue. Okay, my current recommendations. Please give me feedback on these. First, rebuild trust in institutions and organizations, such as government at all levels, as well as healthcare stakeholders, politicians, and we need this trust across the political spectrum. If we can't communicate, we can't communicate if there's no trust. People don't think that SOGI is indoctrinating children if they trust the education system. People don't think that vaccines cause autism if they trust medical institutions, right? We need that trust because any conversations we have without them are not going to go anywhere. I would also argue that we need to have some kind of, I don't like the phrase of rebranding. This one is still a work in progress, but we need to reintroduce maybe what SOGI is, because right now it's got a lot of heat against it, and we need to be able to have facilitate a cohesive, respectful classroom and talk about how this is a tool to do that, to talk about how people from different environments and walks of lives, how we can come together and learn together, which is what this program isn't, or this resource is intended to do, but not where it's currently going. Although this is putting a lot of faith in the people who are against SOGI to assume that they would want to have any kind of respectful conversation on that. Like I said, this is all preliminary. I'd love feedback on any of the recommendations, or if you think anything else would go well. And thank you for listening.